The iron gates of Blackwood Manor groaned a metallic sigh as Clara pushed them open, the sound echoing ominously in the deepening twilight. Rust, like dried blood, stained the ornate scrollwork, and the faint scent of damp earth and decay clung to the air. Behind her, the winding dirt road vanished into a tunnel of ancient, gnarled trees, their skeletal branches clawing at the bruised evening sky, leaving her utterly alone. This was it. Her refuge. Her prison. She clutched the oversized leather bag strap digging into her shoulder, its weight a physical manifestation of the emotional baggage she carried. Blackwood Manor, inherited from a distant, forgotten aunt she barely remembered, was meant to be her escape. An isolated sanctuary where the clamor of the world, and more importantly, the relentless accusations of her own mind, could finally be silenced. She had read about it in the cryptic will, a vast, decaying estate in a forgotten corner of the countryside, promising solitude. But as her gaze swept over the sprawling Gothic edifice, its stone facade a tapestry of ivy and shadow, the windows like vacant eyes staring out from under heavy brows, a cold tremor snaked down her spine. The house didn't look like a sanctuary, it looked like a tomb or perhaps a hungry maw waiting to consume. The front door, a massive slab of dark oak studded with iron, opened with a mournful creak as if protesting her intrusion. Inside, the air was still and cold, thick with the scent of dust, old wood, and something indefinable, something ancient and stagnant like forgotten grief. Moonlight, filtering through tall, grimy windows, cast spectral patterns across the checkered marble floor of the grand foyer. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams, illuminated like tiny, lost souls caught in a forgotten dance. The silence was not peaceful, it was a living entity pressing in on her, absorbing every sound. Clara dropped her bag with a thud that seemed swallowed by the vast, oppressive silence. Her breath plumed in the chill, each exhalation a misty cloud swallowed by the gloom. She wasn't one for fanciful notions, not typically. Her life had been one of logic, of predictable schedules and tangible realities. But Blackwood Manor had an undeniable aura, a heavy presence that pressed in on her, making the hairs on her arms stand on end, a cold dread seeping into her bones. She shivered, though not entirely from the cold. It was the house, she realized, already working its insidious magic. She moved through the silent house, each of her footsteps amplified, echoing in the cavernous rooms, her presence feeling shockingly intrusive. The furniture was draped in white sheets, ghostly shrouds over forgotten lives, looming forms in the dim light. In the vast drawing room, a grand piano stood silent, its keys yellowed like old teeth, beckoning no music. A thick layer of dust coated everything, a testament to years of neglect or perhaps a deliberate abandonment. The library, a labyrinth of dark wood and countless volumes, smelled of decaying paper and forgotten stories, of knowledge turning to dust. It was a house frozen in time, waiting, observing. She found the kitchen, surprisingly functional, with a sturdy cast iron stove and a working pump. It smelled faintly of old spices and disuse. She boiled water, the simple domestic act a tiny anchor in the sea of unsettling quiet. She ate a cold sandwich, the taste muted by the anxiety gnawing at her. Every creak, every groan of the old house, sent a jolt through her. She was hyper-aware of her solitude, of the sheer isolation that stretched for miles around her. Later, huddled under a thick, musty blanket in what she hoped would be her bedroom, a vast, drafty chamber with a four-poster bed and heavy velvet drapes, Clara listened to the wind whistling through gaps in the window frames. It sounded like a mournful song or perhaps a faint, disembodied whisper. She told herself it was just the house settling, the old wood groaning, the wind playing tricks in the empty spaces. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind, untethered from the usual distractions of city life, drifted inevitably to that day. The day Thomas died. The day the car swerved. The blinding headlights. The scream abruptly cut short. And the crushing, suffocating weight of knowing she could have prevented it. The argument, their last one, over something trivial, now seemed monstrous in its insignificance. "Just look at the road, Clara," Thomas had joked, reaching to playfully cover her eyes for a split second, a moment of reckless affection. But that split second had been enough. The truck, the swerve, the sickening crunch. Her eyes had been closed. Oh God, her eyes had been closed. She squeezed her eyes shut now, reliving the horror, a tear tracing a cold path down her temple. "Not here," she pleaded silently. "Not now. Let me find peace here." But even in the deepest recesses of her memory, as the wind sighed outside, she could almost hear a faint, distant murmur, like a mocking echo of her inner torment. The whispers began subtly, almost imperceptibly on the second morning. While brewing tea in the kitchen, the very kettle seemed to hiss a low, sibilant sound that wasn't steam. It was too quick, too soft to be anything definite. The kettle, she told herself, or the old pipes. Her nerves were frayed, she was hearing things. She needed rest, a sense of normalcy. She tried to clean, to bring life back to the dusty rooms, but the silence seemed to absorb her efforts, leaving the air heavy and oppressive. By the third day, the whispers had grown more distinct, more insistent. Sitting in the library, sunlight streaming through a particularly clear window, she was engrossed in an old botanical text, trying to lose herself in the Latin names of ancient flora. Then, from the shadowed corner behind a tall bookshelf, she heard it again. This time it was more like a sigh, thin and reedy, followed by a faint, almost melodic Clara. The sound hung in the air, a breath exhaled in a quiet room, yet devoid of a source. Her head snapped up. The room was empty. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She stood, pulling the book protectively against her chest, as if it could shield her from the unseen. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky, barely a whisper itself. Only silence answered, vast and mocking, punctuated by the faint creak of the house settling, or perhaps, something else shifting within its ancient bones. She walked to the corner, peering behind the bookshelf, running her hand along the dusty spines, but found nothing but dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, indifferent to her terror. Hallucinations, she thought, a cold dread beginning to curl in her stomach, tightening its grip. "You're just tired. Stressed. You're alone and your mind is playing tricks." But the whispers persisted, gaining confidence with each passing hour, like a predator circling its prey. They were always just at the edge of her hearing, like secrets whispered behind cupped hands, impossible to fully grasp, yet undeniably present. Sometimes they sounded like a child's mournful sob, a high-pitched lament that pricked at her maternal instincts she didn't know she possessed. Other times, a low, guttural murmur, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the floorboards. But increasingly they started to coalesce, to form words, chillingly clear words directed at her. One evening, as she struggled to light a fire in the drawing-room hearth, the damp wood stubbornly refusing to catch, a clear, sibilant voice slithered from the chimney. "You, let him." It hissed, the words drawn out, elongated, like a serpent's tongue. The unlit logs seemed to shimmer in the deepening gloom, reflecting her rising terror. Clara froze, her hand still holding the matchbox, forgotten. Her breath hitched in her throat, a gasp caught between fear and recognition. The words resonated with a sickening familiarity, echoing the accusations she had hurled at herself countless times in the lonely nights. What was that?" she stammered, looking around wildly, her eyes darting into every shadowed corner. The room was still, save for the dancing shadows cast by the dying light outside, the last vestiges of sunset fading from the windows. "You could have stopped it." A new voice, older, raspy, seemed to rise from beneath the very floorboards, its sound like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "Why didn't you, Clara? Why didn't you look?" This time, the question was not merely an accusation. It was a taunt, delivered with a chilling certainty. Fear, raw and primal, clawed at her throat, constricting her airway. This wasn't her imagination. These weren't the house settling. These were voices, intelligent and malicious, speaking directly to her deepest wound, to the gaping chasm of her guilt. She scrambled backward, knocking over a small side table. The ceramic vase on it shattered with a loud crash that reverberated through the silent room, sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet, shattering the illusion of normalcy. She fled. She ran blindly through the darkened corridors, the whispers chasing her, growing louder, more numerous, no longer discreet but bold and overwhelming. "Coward!" one shrieked from the stairwell, its voice sharp and piercing like shattered glass. "Murderer!" another cried from the portrait gallery, a disembodied echo from the dusty canvases. "His blood on your hands." A chorus of unseen voices whispered from every direction, surrounding her, suffocating her, forming an inescapable net of sound. "You closed your eyes, Clara. You chose." She reached her bedroom, fumbling desperately with the heavy brass knob, her hands slick with cold sweat. She burst inside, slamming the door shut and twisting the flimsy lock, a futile gesture against an unseen enemy. Trembling, she pressed her hands over her ears, curling into a fetal position on the floor beside the bed. But the voices penetrated, slipping through the cracks in the walls, under the door, seeping through the very pores of the ancient stone, echoing inside her very skull. They were no longer faint murmurs. They were a cacophony, a discordant choir of accusation, each note a barb tearing at her already raw nerves. She spent the night huddled in the corner of the bed, eyes wide open, staring into the oppressive darkness that pulsed with unseen life. The voices never ceased. They wove intricate narratives of her guilt, twisting every memory, magnifying every regret, painting horrific tableaus in her mind. They spoke of Thomas, his vibrant laughter, his kind eyes, the way he would always gently pull her hair when he was teasing her. They spoke of their last argument, the reckless speed she had been driving, the exact moment she closed her eyes just for a second. The voices, it seemed, knew everything. They reveled in her pain, drinking it in like a starving beast. They were her guilt, given form, given voice, given malicious intent. The days that followed blurred into a terrifying kaleidoscope of escalating horror. The voices were no longer confined to whispers. They began to manifest physically, subtly at first, then with increasing aggression. A cold gust of wind, even when the windows were sealed shut, would sweep through a room, carrying with it the undeniable scent of Thomas's cologne, a cruel reminder of what she had lost and why. Doors would creak open and slam shut with invisible force, echoing like thunderclaps through the silent house. Objects would move, a book sliding off a shelf with a soft thud, a teacup rattling precariously on its saucer before tipping over and shattering on the floor. Once, while she stood transfixed, a porcelain doll, dusty and cracked, turned its head slowly to stare at her with vacant, painted eyes. Clara began to see things in her peripheral vision, fleeting shadows that darted through doorways, figures that coalesced in the gloom, only to vanish when she turned to face them directly. Once, she saw a clear, unmistakable impression of a child's small handprint pressed into the dust on the grand piano, as if left by a curious, ghostly child. It wasn't there minutes later, only the pristine layer of dust. The house was playing with her, tormenting her with glimpses of its other, unseen residents, feeding her fear. The voices knew her routines, her thoughts, twisting them against her. When she tried to read, the words on the page would blur, replaced by ghostly script forming accusations, condemning her with every sentence. When she tried to eat, the food tasted like ash, and she'd hear faint chewing sounds from empty chairs around the dining table, or the clinking of unseen cutlery. Sleep became impossible. Every attempt to rest was met with a barrage of auditory torment. The screeching sound of a car braking suddenly, the sickening crunch of metal, a child's cries echoing from the walls, Thomas's dying gasp, over and over, trapped in a horrifying loop. She saw his face in the shadows, his eyes wide, accusing. She saw the flash of the headlights, felt the lurch of the car, smelled the burning rubber. She found herself talking back to them, screaming into the empty air, begging them to stop, to leave her alone. "Leave me alone," she'd shriek, tears streaming down her face, her throat raw from the effort. "I know what I did. I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But her pleas only seemed to fuel their malevolence, their voices growing stronger, more gleeful, invigorated by her despair. They were feeding literally on her agony. One afternoon, driven to the brink of madness, her mind a fragmented landscape of terror and regret, Clara stumbled into the dusty library, pulling books from shelves with frantic, desperate energy, scattering them on the floor. She needed a distraction, a shred of normalcy, anything to silence the internal and external clamor. Her fingers, numb with exhaustion, brushed against a hidden latch behind a particularly heavy volume, an ancient, leather-bound tome on Gothic architecture. It clicked open with a faint sound, revealing a small, dark alcove hidden behind a false panel. Inside, nestled amongst cobwebs and brittle, yellowed newspapers from another century, was a faded leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by time. She pulled it out, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped it. The cover was blank, save for a faint, almost indecipherable impression of a crest. But the first page, written in elegant, looping script, clearly feminine, was dated 1888. The journal belonged to Eleanor Blackwood, the manor's previous owner. Clara began to read, her eyes scanning the yellowed pages, hungry for escape, for any connection to a reality outside her torment. Eleanor's early entries spoke of a loving family, a happy home, the joyful innocence of her beloved son Edward. But then the tone shifted, subtly at first, then dramatically. Her son Edward had died in a tragic carriage accident, a horrifying echo of Clara's own nightmare. The accident had been caused by a moment of his governess's negligence, a momentary lapse, a distraction, a brief turning away. Eleanor's grief was palpable, raw and agonizing, but something else emerged from the pages, a simmering resentment, a cold, clinical fixation on the governess's guilt. She carries it, his death, like a festering wound, Eleanor had meticulously recorded. I see it in her eyes, the shadows of his last breath reflected there. I feel it in the air, the density of her remorse. The house too knows. It senses the rupture, the imbalance. It feeds on it, her anguish. It strengthens with every tear she sheds, every silent confession of her failure, every flicker of self-condemnation. It breathes her despair. Clara's blood ran cold. The words resonated with a terrifying, uncanny familiarity. Eleanor wrote of the governess's eventual descent into madness, driven by the relentless, unseen torment that mirrored Clara's own experience. The governess, identified only as Miss Hayes, had become withdrawn, haunted, plagued by whispers and apparitions, eventually speaking only in frantic, apologetic whispers to unseen entities. The journal's final chilling entries described how Miss Hayes had ultimately taken her own life within the manor walls, succumbing to the overwhelming, amplified guilt, becoming another source of sustenance for the insatiable house. Eleanor seemed to almost revel in Miss Hayes's demise, seeing it as a twisted form of justice, completely blind to the true, insidious nature of the manor. A chilling realization dawned on Clara, a realization so profound it left her gasping for breath. Blackwood Manor wasn't just haunted, it was a psychological predator. It didn't simply contain malevolent spirits, it attracted and amplified human guilt, twisting it into a potent, agonizing force that manifested as voices, shadows, and increasingly aggressive physical manifestations. It was a parasitic entity, a psychic vampire, feeding on remorse, growing stronger with each tormented soul that crossed its threshold, draining them dry until they were mere husks, their pain absorbed into the very fabric of the house. And now it had found her. It had found her because she was the perfect prey, overflowing with the very sustenance it craved. The voices, as if sensing her terrifying epiphany, surged with renewed, frenzied energy. They were no longer just whispers or accusations. They were full-blown screams, the wails of 1,000 tormented souls, a discordant symphony of anguish that ripped through the air. She knew. She knew, a child's voice shrieked, raw with betrayal. You could have warned him. You could have seen. Thomas's voice, distorted and agonizing, echoed from every corner of the room, magnified and twisted into a monstrous parody of his former self. Why didn't you look, Clara? Why didn't you look? You let me die. The air vibrated with their hatred, their hunger. The room grew impossibly cold, a pervasive chill that seeped into her bones, making them ache. The air thickened, heavy with unseen presences, with a malevolent energy that now permeated every molecule. Shadows writhed on the walls, stretching, contorting into grotesque shapes, skeletal figures, accusing fingers, faces contorted in agony. A gust of wind, smelling of damp earth and decay, slammed the heavy library door shut, plunging the room into near darkness, illuminated only by the faint, dying light filtering through the grimy windows. Clara could feel them, invisible hands reaching for her, clawing at her sanity, pulling at her hair, whispering directly into her ears. She felt a phantom weight on her chest, pressing her down, stealing her breath. She fell to her knees, the journal clutched against her chest like a shield, a desperate talisman against the overwhelming horror. The truth, however horrifying, however soul-shattering, ignited a tiny, defiant spark within her. This wasn't about redemption anymore, it was about survival. The manor wanted to break her, to consume her guilt until there was nothing left but another tormented echo in its cold, stone walls, another feeding source for its insatiable hunger. She wouldn't let it. Not her. Not Thomas. I won't, she screamed, her voice hoarse, raw, pushing against the unseen force that pressed down on her. I won't let you. You won't have me. The voices seemed to falter for a moment, a discordant screech of surprise, a collective intake of 1,000 non-existent breaths. They were used to despair, to surrender, to a slow, agonizing unraveling of the soul. Not this defiant, desperate cry for freedom. They had miscalculated her breaking point. You are guilty, 100 voices roared back, trying to drown her out, to reassert their dominance. You are worthless. You are a murderer. You deserve this pain. You killed him. Yes. Clara shrieked, tears streaming down her face, blurring her vision, but her eyes held a new, fierce light, a burning defiance. Yes, I am guilty. I drove too fast. I was distracted. I argued with him. I closed my eyes, and he died. Because of me. His death is on my hands. The confession, raw and agonizing, ripped from her soul, tearing at the last vestiges of her self-preservation instincts, seemed to briefly silence the cacophony. The air in the library shimmered, the shadows momentarily recoiling, as if struck by a blinding light. The manor, it seemed, was shocked. It had expected denial, a slow, agonizing unraveling, a desperate clinging to innocence. Not this brutal, unfiltered admission of self-blame. "I carry it," she continued, rising shakily to her feet, her legs trembling but holding her upright. "Every single day. Every minute. It's heavier than any stone, deeper than any grave. It is my cross to bear. I live with it. I feel it. It is my punishment. But it doesn't belong to you." She pointed a trembling finger at the unseen entities swirling around her, her gaze burning with a desperate, furious resolve. "It belongs to me. My guilt, my pain, my sorrow. And you won't take it from me. You won't break me with it. You won't turn me into another Miss Hayes. I will carry it, but I will live." Her words, charged with a desperate, defiant energy born of pure survival instinct, seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the manor. The voices began to shriek again, a chorus of impotent rage, their screams now tinged with frustration, with a raw, almost human anger. But there was a subtle shift. Their power, fed by her resistance, seemed to dissipate, if only slightly. The heavy weight in the air lessened, the cold receded marginally, and the shadows on the walls seemed to shrink back, their grotesque forms less defined. They were not defeated, but they were wounded. They had feasted on her denial and her internal struggle, but her raw admission and subsequent ownership of her guilt had, paradoxically, cut off their supply. Clara stumbled out of the library, not fleeing in terror as she had before, but walking with a new, grim determination etched on her exhausted face. She didn't know if her confession would save her, if it would banish the entities or simply diminish their hold. But she had reclaimed her pain, taken ownership of her guilt. It was hers and she would carry it, but she wouldn't let it be weaponized against her by a malevolent house. She would endure. She reached the grand foyer, the moonlight now streaming in through the tall, uncleaned windows, painting the checkered marble floor in stark black and white patterns. The whispers were still there, a low, angry hum, a furious buzzing that still tried to penetrate her defenses, but they felt less overwhelming, less able to penetrate her defenses. She could still hear Thomas's voice, accusatory, but now, mixed with it, she heard a faint echo of his laughter, a memory that had been buried deep under layers of torment, a memory she hadn't dared to recall. It was a fragile, hopeful sound, a glimpse of the Thomas she loved, not the one she had lost. Clara knew then that she couldn't stay. Blackwood Manor would forever be a monument to her torment, a place where her guilt would always be sought out and amplified, where the air itself hung heavy with the echoes of despair. But she also knew that she wouldn't be leaving the same person who had arrived. She was scarred, deeply so, the marks of her battle etched onto her soul, but she hadn't been broken. She had faced the darkest parts of herself, illuminated by the spectral glow of the manor's malevolence, and she had survived. She had stood in the abyss and chosen to climb out. She walked to the massive front door, her hand reaching for the cold iron handle. The whispers clawed at her, a last desperate attempt to hold her captive, to drag her back into the consuming darkness. "You'll never forget," they hissed, their voices fading slightly. "It will always be there. Always." "I know," Clara whispered back, her voice quiet but firm, a strength she hadn't known she possessed now underpinning her words. "It will. But it won't be yours anymore. It's mine. And I choose to live with it, not die by it." With a grunt of effort, she pulled the heavy door open, its mournful creak now sounding less like a sigh of sorrow and more like a groan of defeat. The night air, crisp and clean, washed over her face, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant rain, not decay, not the stench of stagnant grief. She stepped out, her eyes fixed on the distant, faint glow of the rising moon above the tree line. She didn't look back at the looming shadow of Blackwood Manor, its dark facade now looking less like a hungry maw and more like a defeated tyrant. She didn't need to. Its whispers would follow her, a faint echo in the corners of her mind, a constant reminder of the darkness she had faced and the strength she had found. But they were just whispers now, like the rustling of leaves in a far-off breeze, not roaring accusations. Aunt Clara, finally, was walking into the light, carrying her burden, but carrying it on her own terms. The manor had tried to consume her guilt, but instead she had consumed the manor's truth, and in doing so found a path, however faint, back to herself, back to life.